Welcome to Legal Tech Week for July 31st, 2020, our weekly roundtable where we talk about the top stories in legal tech, innovation, and kind of whatever area we want to talk about, I guess. That's the general idea, though. I am Bob Ambrogi. I write the blog LawSites and have the podcast LawNext. And our panelists this week are the people you see here. I'll let you all introduce yourselves. Joe, I don't think I ever start with you, so how about we start with you?
Fair enough. Joe Patrice from Above the Law. I am back in my usual place. Last week I was in a different location, so it's nice to be back with the yellow dinosaur over my shoulder.
Yeah. Victor.
Hi, I'm Victor Lee. I'm Assistant Managing Editor for the ABA Journal. I manage the Business of Law section. And my typical disclaimer is that I do not speak for the ABA or for the Journal. And if I say something stupid on this, then I do not speak for myself either.
That's a good one. Caroline Hill.
Hi there, I'm Caroline Hill, as you just said. No need to repeat that. Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider, based in the UK, with global audience writing about all things legal technology.
Yep. And Molly McDonough.
Hi, Molly McDonough. I'm a media strategist and communications consultant and former editor and publisher of the ABA Journal.
And last but not least, Nikki Black.
I am Nikki Black. I am the legal technology evangelist with MyCase practice management software. I am a legal technology columnist. I write regular columns for the ABA Journal, Above the Law, the Daily Record, and the MyCase blog, among others.
So we could sort of go John Krasinski this week because we've got a couple of good news stories that we can talk about, but we've got plenty of bad news stories too to talk about. But Caroline, you've got a good news story. You want to start with that?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, so I have got to come in for a little bit of flack on LinkedIn from people who say that I only ever write bad news stories about Zoom, which actually...
Don't shoot the messenger.
It actually is true. So I don't think I've ever written a good news story about Zoom, despite the fact that we all have to acknowledge that Zoom is the darling of COVID and has been credited with keeping some firms afloat. But all I ever seem to write about is the security flaws and the Zoom bombing and all that kind of stuff. So this week I wrote about Cole Scott and Cathane, who they actually work directly with the senior execs at Zoom, which is quite cool in itself. So the chief executive knows the CIO at Zoom, Jason Thomas, and they called it standardized around Zoom, which the press release from Zoom said standardized. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And what it means is they've mostly got rid of WebEx, and they've mostly got rid of LifeSize, which are their two other communication tools, in favor of Zoom. So they've now grouped around Zoom. But my headline was something a bit different, actually. I went with the line that because they attributed the lack of layoffs or pay cuts to Zoom. So in this press release, which we published on the 23rd of July, they said that they're obviously a litigation firm based in Florida, as I said. They said they've managed to conduct hearings, they've managed to proceed with business, not business as normal, but they've managed to proceed in, they've managed to stay busy and can keep their cases running through Zoom. And so they credit it, as I said, with no layoffs and no pay cuts, which I thought was pretty amazing.
I'm curious, was the source of that press release the law firm or Zoom itself?
It was Zoom. And actually, I worked with them on it because I knew about it in advance. But it was, it came from Zoom, which is really unusual because, as you know, like in terms of the Zoom, the legal sector, I think is pretty minuscule. So it's pretty cool that they're paying attention to the sector and what's going on.
Yeah.
So today, Ari Kaplan did his 100th episode of his virtual lunch and featured David Latt, and he was saying some very similar things about the industry. It was just, there was a lot of fear and frozen behavior in the beginning, and then firms realized that they had plenty of business still and still could connect with clients and they're having much better quarters than they thought they were going to have. And so things are ramping up, and then, which is I'll leave it to Bob, but kind of a good segue into the data that Nikki proposed today.
Yeah. Well, you can. That's okay. You can do the segue if you want. Just did anybody else have any thoughts on that? I mean, it's kind of. I mean, probably every law firm in the country right now has some story about how Zoom has helped them in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not avoid layoffs or whatever, but there isn't a law firm in the country right now, I think, that's still alive that can't somehow attribute it to Zoom or at least to some video conferencing software.
And it's so easy to use, as we've said, and so what it means is in terms of the cultural impact, what's fascinating is, and I think I've mentioned this before, that even the most tech averse, and I get this direct from the CIOs, as I'm sure you do, even the most tech averse partners are now living in Zoom. And it's really changing the face of business now and going forward. Yeah.
Well, and in our second Good News Network story of the day, Nikki, MyCase had done a survey a while ago of the impact of COVID on law firms, and you've just revisited that, I guess, and it wasn't all bad.
Right. Well, we did a second survey. The first one was early on in COVID, and then this was a follow-up survey to see how things were changing, and a lot of the areas of focus involved, their biggest pain points in terms of actually trying to run their practices and represent clients, and also forward facing too, like what were the tools that were helping them get through this, and then also what are the things they're doing to help for business continuity down the road in light of all the uncertainties. And so there were a lot of interesting results, but the ones that I think were the most interesting and not necessarily surprising as we go through this whole COVID-19 thing is, first of all, that sort of in keeping with what everyone else was just saying, this theme of firms are actually able to conduct business. They were initially stalled. They didn't know what to do. A few jumped onto the tech bandwagon right away. Others still wanted to wait and see what happened. But over time, they're all starting to find that they're able to run their practices, bring in more business, and they're still not all exactly where they had been by any means, but they're staying financially stable, maybe isn't the word, but they're maintaining, they're having income coming in the door, and they're actually doing better than they had expected to be doing. So that was one finding. Another one was remote work, when the survey was taken, the second survey was down from when it was initially taken, which was the first one was early on in the during COVID, and remote work was around 70% of firms were working remotely, and now it was down to about 40%. But I would suggest that those numbers are going to fluctuate wildly over time, simply because there's surges in different areas of the country, and that people are opening up, shutting back down, only bringing some people into the office. And so I think that those remote working numbers are going to fluctuate, and we can expect that over time. But the one thing that really did seem to be constant and actually was increasing was, and I would argue, yes, Zoom has gotten lawyers through this, but really it's the technology behind Zoom, cloud computing. Cloud computing is what has allowed lawyers to continue working. And so, which I'm thrilled about, because I've been trying to get lawyers to use the cloud since probably about 2008. My book came out in 2012, and back then people were still, I don't know about the cloud. Oh, it's a little insecure. Now, this to me is like, oh, like, my gosh, they're finally using it. So the statistics were that in the first survey, something like 45%, if I recall correctly, of lawyers were either already using the cloud or looking to use it. And now about a little over 70% were saying that cloud is what has gotten them through this, and they're starting to invest in the cloud for forward thinking in terms of future proofing their firms from either surges or just other uncertainties that they may face down the road. So this really is, cloud computing is what is making it possible for business to continue as usual, and for all of us just to watch Netflix, to binge watch shows, to actually have something going on while we're all stuck in our houses. If it wasn't for the cloud, it'd be a very different life that we're all living. So there were a lot of really interesting results from this survey, some surprising, some not, but the cloud is, I would suggest, the one that I really hang my head on and the happiest about.
And Nikki, I had a question. Sorry.
Go ahead, Victor.
So I had a question about the survey. So one thing that kind of caught my interest was it looks like, in this section it says, in the next month, I anticipate my firm's workload will be, then the choices are overwhelmingly high, or normal. And it seems like there's a pretty good, it's a pretty good mix of responses, but it seems like most responses are in the high and overwhelmingly high. So they're feeling good about about the work coming in and being able to have clients and whatnot. Did you? I don't know if you guys drilled down to the like nuts and bolts, but were there any like specific areas or any specific like types of areas of the law that were especially, where the lawyers were like, oh, we're going to be slammed, or we're going to have like lots of people coming in?
The survey itself, we did not go that in depth, but I'm heavily involved in my bar association locally. I'm on the board, and prior to that, I was the chair of the tech committee, and so I attend a decent number of bar association events and talk to a lot of lawyers. And the gist that I've been getting is that, boots on the ground, if you will, is that lawyers are transactional lawyers. There's a lot of wills. Wills are a huge thing. So a lot of wills, trust and estates lawyers are definitely, and also with kids going off to college, for example. I have a kid going off to college. Lots of people doing powers of attorneys and all these other documents for their kids that are going off into another state. So I think there's a lot of transactional work being done. Divorce lawyers, everyone's expecting that to go through the roof, but the ones I've talked to, that has not necessarily happened yet, but they anticipate a rather an increased caseload. And then all the litigators are becoming busier and busier as the courts get used to Zoom, as they're able to start moving all these cases forward using that functionality, and everyone knows how to do it. One interesting thing that happened during the very first Board of Trustees meeting that I attended was the incoming president said, if you could just share my screen, and then the current president said, would you have ever thought you'd say something like that? He's like, no, I didn't even know what Zoom was 2 months ago. Like, they're just all adept at Zooming, as I recently heard a judge call it. But so, you're definitely, because the courts are becoming more adept with Zoom and lawyers are, and because more and more people are using the cloud, I think that the litigators are starting to see their cases move. Criminal defense, and anecdotally, I've heard that that's really a tough one. Not a lot of people getting arrested. They just have the cases that they already previously had that they're trying to work through the system. So I hope that helped. The survey didn't dive into that, but that's what I've seen.
One of the things that I would love to see more reporting on is because there has been this anticipation that there would be a flood, at least in certain areas, plus the opening back up, and then just kind of a crush of cases. So the courts have been focused on doing more case management. But I'm wondering kind of how these firms are managing surge capacity. If they're going to alternative service providers, if they're trying to figure out how to ramp up using other services to add attorneys and capacity to some of these particular cases, if they're diverting resources. I kind of expect that there's some alternative service providers who would be well positioned to take advantage of surges. But I haven't seen too much reporting on that yet.
Yeah, no, I haven't.
What I was thinking about the ALSPs as well, Molly, with this report, thinking it would be interesting because one of the interesting things that I've heard is that despite what's going on with COVID, etc., that the need for repapering is very much ongoing. The deadlines haven't changed. All the LIBOR stuff is still ongoing, all the regulatory stuff. So it's interesting to see how and obviously a lot of that is getting moved to ALSPs, which I imagine is keeping them very busy because there's no interruption to that whatsoever.
Yeah. In terms of the practice areas that are spiking, there's lots of bits and pieces of reporting around that coming out. But I had earlier this week interviewed Kristen Sande, the co-founder of Paladin, which is this, the pro bono management platform for kind of larger law firms. But she did a Medium post this week where she crunched the numbers of pro bono cases coming through their platform. And it was really interesting because bankruptcy cases, they saw a 350% surge in pro bono bankruptcy and debt cases from the first quarter of the year to the second quarter of the year. The other big ones were education, health, housing, trust and estates, all up, huge spikes in the pro bono area for those kinds of cases. So that doesn't speak broadly, but it gives you one piece of the pie in terms of what's going on there.
Yeah, we did a story a couple months or so ago, or just I think it might have been in our last issue, that just looked at bankruptcy lawyers and how, and this goes back to even, like with other slowdowns, other recessions, just whenever things get bad, law firms just start to stock up on their bankruptcy lawyers. They start trying to poach high performing partners, or they try to acquire small specialized boutiques that might give them an edge up, give them a leg up on the competition. It's just whenever these things are cyclical, and whenever the cycle goes to the bad end, then they're gonna stock up on their bankruptcy lawyers, just because they assume that when the economy gets bad, more people are going to be filing. So but I was just curious about other industries besides that, and I think like that, it actually makes a lot of sense that divorce was the one that we all heard about, like, people are going to be going crazy, being cooped up in their houses all day with their spouses and whatnot, so it was interesting to just read through the post that Nikki sent, and just seeing, like, I guess there is a lot of optimism and a lot of as far as like workloads and things coming through the pipeline, that lawyers aren't dreading the next few months at least.
Yeah.
So on the divorce front, actually, we had a podcast, one of our ATL special COVID casts, talking with a divorce lawyer about it. And we kind of talked about this, and he said that they are busy, but not with divorces. It's not that there were a bunch of divorces because people were stuck at home. But what I hadn't thought of that he was walking me through is the sheer workload of rearranging orders for child visitation, and like, you can't have them on the weekend because they've been in this state and whatever. And so it's been that sort of work that's been keeping him busy, which I never would have imagined. Like, we were all kind of thinking about the fights while you're in quarantine, but it's really the existing divorces and all that is connected to those having to be renegotiated that's been keeping that industry going.
That's what my one friend had told me too about her caseload, and that it wasn't the new cases coming in yet, but they did expect it. But it was that type of thing. All the whose kid gets to go where during COVID, and how can you visit when there's COVID? Yeah, a lot of that.
I spoke to Erin Levine early on and have been following how she's been managing her family law practice. And one of the things she did early on was do an FAQ on custodial relationships. And I mean, she just, that post that she did just attracted an enormous number of comments. And so now she's really kind of stepped up how she presents that information. And I wrote about it a couple of times about how this is was a booming area for family lawyers. Not unexpected if you think about it, but not where everybody else was saying we will see an increase. But it makes perfect sense, especially, I started seeing disputes over, because one parent wasn't as careful with having masks and social distancing than the other, and that led to major friction in custodial relationships. So, yeah.
Well, in another area where it's been all good news, the online bar exams are going really well. Right, Joe?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been a super week for bar exams. Indiana's bar exam was scheduled for Tuesday. It did not happen. The tech problems with it were overwhelming, and they decided to call it off. I'll get back to that in a second. In the meantime, we'll talk about Michigan, which they were run by ExamSoft. They lasted all of about an hour, I think, before that collapsed. They claim that it was a sophisticated cyber attack. I think a lot of us are somewhat suspicious that it might just be that 500 people were trying to use the thing at the same time. But whatever it was,
it sounds like a cyber attack.
Yeah, in either event, it's not good, right? In either event, it doesn't bode well that they're having these sorts of issues with a relatively small exam being the only one of the day, when they're looking at having multiple states doing this all at the same time in October, including giant jurisdictions like New York. So that's Michigan. Indiana, as I previewed earlier, they put off their exam and decided instead they're just going to do it over email. They're going to email out questions. You email back the answer. It's open book. There's no proctoring. They can't do it. But it really just makes you wonder, at this point, what great lengths are we willing to go to avoid just giving diploma privilege? Like, if at this point that it's open book and proctorless, what's the point?
Yeah. I noticed that also, that speaking of your podcast, you had the diploma privilege people on your podcast this week or last week. I'm dying to hear that. But what did they have to say about all that?
Well, they were largely talking about the work that they were doing with different exams, jurisdictions to try and get stuff done. Washington obviously was a success story for them, but they've been trying hard in other places, and they really recounted a lot of the, just the reticence that they get when they talk to bar examiners about it, and the clout that the NCBE holds over the entire industry. It's not great. And I mean, this is, since that podcast, we have this draft ABA proposition which it's not the strongest worded proposal ever, but it basically says, we, the ABA, think that it's ridiculous that you try and run an in-person bar exam right now because gestures wildly around. And it's getting pushback from the NCBE has said they'll oppose it, and a bunch of other state bars have said that they're not on board. And it just makes you wonder, at what point does this death cult have to stop, right? Like they are pushing forward with this based on really nothing. And all the evidence is that this is dangerous to do right now. And they just won't hear any alternative.
Well, and didn't I just read that in Colorado, they gave the bar and someone tested positive? And they had to notify everybody in all the room with that person, like 20 people.
It was a 200. They were in the 200 person location. They were at Sturm Law School, so they were at the 200 person location. The woman who tested positive, actually, the only reason we know is she had a planned surgical procedure coming up, and she got tested for completely other reasons because it was a necessary part of getting ready for that. So she got her results after the test was over. That, oh, by the way, while you were preparing for this, it turns out you have COVID. So she had taken the whole test as a pre-symptomatic COVID patient. And this is exactly what was expected. And it puts a lie to all these bar exams saying we can go forward with it because we're taking people's temperatures, as though that actually helps.
As if that means anything, right?
Yeah.
We just take the president's lead and just delay it. We'll delay the election, delay the bar exams, just put it all off till next year sometime.
And meanwhile, they want us to put all our kids back in school, but that's a whole different issue. But it's the same thing, you know? It's crazy time.
Yeah. I should say I alluded to, I think I called them the diploma privileged people, but the organization is United for Diploma Privilege. They have a website. They're an organized group of people who are lobbying for this, and they've been pretty active over the last month or so. So, any other thoughts on that? What else? Victor, did you want to talk about? You kind of mentioned the big four, I guess, testifying this week before Congress. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's just. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just watched clips of it. I mean, just watching an entire congressional hearing is like, but I think
Jeff Bezos said.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in the sense that, like, and I actually struggled about whether or not to broach this one, because I figured, all right, well, it's a big enough story that it's probably worth talking about. But is anything really going to happen, from these efforts? Because, I mean, just in general, I mean, even if you don't look at it like, Washington is broken and the parties just can't agree to anything, and nothing's going to happen unless one party just takes unified control of the government. But even then, it's like, I mean, like, when was the last real tech antitrust issue where it looked like a company was going to get broken up? Was it Microsoft in the 90s, I think? And that didn't happen. And I think, so it's just, but I think the issues that they were talking about were interesting. Just the idea of, look, it's a different, things have changed considerably since those days. Now you have companies like, Google and Facebook and, and whatnot, just accumulating all this data and all this information, and just how like how should they be, like, should they be regulated like a utility, or should there be some rules as to what they can and can't do with that information? And I think just in that sense is an interesting debate, but whether or not anything actually happens as a result of that hearing is probably debatable.
Yeah, and meanwhile, that was what, Wednesday, I think, and then yesterday Amazon reported $88.9 billion in quarterly sales, a 40% increase over the prior year. The New York Times article that talks about it quotes somebody saying, "Simply put, COVID-19 has injected Amazon with a growth hormone." I mean, it's just crazy what's going on with these companies as their profits and revenues just surge during this time. And are they monopolies? Yeah, they are. Should something be done? I guess that's the question.
Do you think that the Justice Department is going to make good on its threat to sue? And
I don't see it happening.
The problem right now is that the Justice Department's posturing is more tied to their boss's complaint that Facebook and Twitter censor him than the actual serious issue, which is we have monopolies growing. But and unfortunately, I worry that that's going to carry over. And when there's a new administration, they're not going to do anything because they're going to, it's just like, oh, well, he wanted it for that reason, so we're not going to be mad at the tech companies. When in reality, there's a good reason to want to break up some of these businesses for non-political reasons.
I do wonder how we've allowed really for them to reach the state where they have so much power and lack of transparency. I mean, we've talked about fake news. We've talked about the impact of Facebook and some of the content in terms of political process. We've talked about how we know that. Particularly with the social media companies of Facebook, that they're undermining potentially the political process, and it feels like the governments around the world are being completely spineless. And there are obviously many other issues, and it feels like this feels a bit like a show grilling, but it's incredible to me that they're not doing more about it. And I think hopefully with hindsight, we'll get to a position where we can look back with being incredulous, but I'm not actually sure whether anything's going to change.
Sorry.
No, sorry, Victor.
Sorry. I mean, I think a big reason is just like a lot of people in government just don't understand how this stuff works. Like they're ignorant of, because if you look at like Standard Oil, okay, you understand Standard Oil. It's very easy to see. Okay, they were a monopoly because they controlled 98% of the country's oil. So it's like you go to a gas station, you get charged more than you should, and you get pissed. But like for Facebook, I mean, a lot of people don't even understand a lot of politicians don't even understand who's in charge of Facebook or who's. I mean, there was one politician that asked I think Mark Zuckerberg why Twitter was censoring or taking down tweets by Donald Trump Jr. or censoring him, whatever. And Zuckerberg's like, well, I don't run Twitter. Like that's not my company. So when you're dealing with that level of ignorance or that level of just cluelessness, I feel like that's a hard hurdle to get past.
I do think that it was. I agree with Joe about the red herring of censorship, and Victor's points too. But I was very impressed with the probing questions about anti-competitive practices, and there were some sophisticated questions about the algorithms that boost rankings of their products, and is that anti-competitive? And that's to me what something that Congress could do something, or an oversight organization could do something about, and certainly data privacy and how our data is being used to sell to us and to push products, especially their products that they have more of an interest in.
I think Nadler asked a question that was near and dear to all of us who are in journalism. He asked about what do you have to say, Zuckerberg, about the way in which you artificially inflated the views of videos, which caused journalistic operations around the country to pivot to video and lay people off? And he was like, "Oh yeah, that I regret that." And it's like, oh, okay, well, that was great. But I mean, that's the impact that I think a lot of people don't get about how much power they have. They could make something up that caused bunches of people in a different industry to get laid off.
Yeah. Isn't there also a complacency that's just driven by the fact that we all kind of like these things? I mean, I hate Amazon, but if I need that device delivered to my office this afternoon, that's where I'm going to go. And, I don't want to screw with them too much because I like my overnight delivery or my same day delivery and all that stuff. But
yeah, and maybe that was why Microsoft got into the trouble that they did, or almost got into the trouble they did the Knights, because their product was bad.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to use Internet Explorer. Nobody wanted to use Windows, but we were forced to because they had such a large market share.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anything is going to happen, certainly until after the election. And I do think, if the Democrats get in office and, especially if there's a prominent role for Elizabeth Warren in there somewhere, then we might see some stuff happening.
So we mentioned the Microsoft trial. I actually had this conversation with David Boies, who was the lawyer on the Microsoft trial about a year ago. I asked, do you see any scenario in which antitrust comes back around at the Department of Justice, maybe even if the election happens and the Democrats win? And he basically said exactly what you said, Bobby. He was like, not unless Elizabeth Warren's the person running it. So that's a bleak future, given, that Biden's not exactly her biggest fan.
Right. Yeah. Molly, did you have anything this week? I forget if you...
I didn't pitch anything specifically. I would kind of jump back on. I didn't send this around, but something that Nikki said earlier about people not being arrested as much on the criminal side. That's another area that I don't think has been covered a whole lot. We've been focused on arrests during protests and arrests when they're terrible, but a lot of jurisdictions are holding back on arrests, or at least shifting people into diversion programs.
Or just beat them up and leave them on the street. But
so I think this is an opportunity for a resurgence in technology uses in diversion programs to reach people who have had contact with the justice system in some way, and negative contact with mental health services or other programs reaching into these communities. And there was a great article in the last couple weeks on the Crime Report about telemedicine techniques being used in diversion programs for mental health. And that
we just lost your voice, I think.
Could you guys hear that?
No, we lost your voice for a second there.
Okay, it's because my phone started going crazy.
Oh.
But that's all those diversion programs that are happening right now during COVID are only happening because there's a temporary allowance for doctors and counselors to be able to claim to be reimbursed for services over telephone only and not in person. And that's all going to go away if we shift immediately back to in person without continuing that allowance for doctors. And I think this is, I hadn't really thought about how important it is to continue that outreach into justice-involved communities and also rural communities in ways that can keep people out of the criminal justice system. And I think technology plays a really important role there, but the lawmakers and regulators have to get on board with being able to reimburse the insurance companies or the doctors, the insurance companies reimbursing doctors and medical and social services professionals.
Yeah. Which is a little bit of a segue to the thing I wanted to talk about in some ways, which is the legal deserts, which is not really a tech story, but which has tech elements as we talked about. But the story that I worked on this week that I thought was really the most interesting was just this this ABA came out with its second annual profile of the legal profession, which last year was kind of interesting just in terms of facts and figures around numbers of lawyers and numbers of diversity and numbers of women and that sort of thing. And they've got a lot more of that this year. But they added a new section on so-called legal deserts, which is also interesting to journalists because there's been a lot of reporting lately on news deserts around the country and how that's a growing phenomenon. But essentially what they found, and this isn't a huge surprise, but that although we have more than 1.3 million lawyers in the United States, there are a number of locations in the country in which there are no lawyers or just one or two lawyers. They found that of the country's 3,100 counties in the United States, there are 54 that do not have a single lawyer, and there are another 182 that have just one or two lawyers. That one or two is important because, as they said on a webinar I watched this week, if you have one lawyer in a town, the lawyer stars, but if you have two lawyers in a town, they both thrive, right? Is the old saw. But it's really interesting, and it drives home one of the issues around access to justice, which is that there are a lot of people who live in parts of the country where they just don't have easy physical access to a lawyer. And so that, drives home something that, a lot of those who talk about access to justice have been saying for years, which is that's one of the reasons why it's really important for there to be effective online tools for reaching people. And hopefully those people in those rural areas have access to getting online in the first place. If in an era of video conferencing and legal portals and all of that, you would think that would maybe help address that a little bit, but it's still an issue that many people have to travel long distances to even go to a courthouse or see a lawyer. So.
It is.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, so I really think that some courts have already made some progress in this area with kiosks and other ways to access the courts. But lawyers haven't done a lot other than legal aid agencies, which they are doing a lot to try to develop technologies to bring people in. But again, like Bob said, that access to bandwidth and computers is really hard for some people, and libraries are critically important for that. And when the libraries all shut down during COVID, that cut off a huge access point for a lot of low-income people who were used to dealing with at least their transactional matters over the computer and with Wi-Fi or with an internet connection. So, those are issues that are continuing. I see it as a big opportunity for lawyers to, try to figure out how to serve those populations and especially build in transactional practices in those areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to make the observation. I mean, it's interesting you say about lack of access to technology, which obviously underpins any comments about remote. The progress that we're making with remote conversations. But I do think that there's a huge amount of positivity coming out of this lack of attachment to geography and to physical premises in many ways. It's coming out in the access to justice space. It's coming out in people. So teams are being onboarded. So I wrote a story recently about in the e-discovery or due diligence process when teams are brought on board. Normally they can get to a certain location, but it's becoming increasingly virtual. And actually that's affording job opportunities to people further away from London, for example, where they're being. And I think it's the same, hopefully. But it's an interesting point, Molly, about obviously if you don't have the technology in the first place, then it doesn't help you. So I guess that it's an interesting in terms of how do you take it? How do you start to help? How do you, in terms of the ABA or whoever it might be, terms of the sort of the what do you focus on in terms of helping people? Is it to get better technology and more of it, or is it to try and it's an interesting point, isn't it? What does help look like going forward to try and improve access to justice in those regions?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, there was an ABA panel earlier this week that was around the release of the report, and they talked in part about what's the solution just to getting more lawyers into some of those rural areas, and not sure they had any good answers, but I mean, some of the answers people have talked about before are providing incentives in some way, such as tuition forgiveness programs for lawyers who set up practices in certain kinds of areas, or some kind of maybe loan programs or something to help them get started. And then, and I think the other important issue I think they raised on this panel, I'm confusing my panels because I watched two panels this week that both had some of the same people on them, but there was also the ABA this week did one on the kind of the future of pro bono. The point that they keep making over and over again, and that I think we've made on this show before in other discussions, is that the answer to access to justice isn't always a lawyer, that there are other ways to deliver legal services and other professionals who can deliver legal help and legal services. So part of the answer in some of the more rural areas is probably to look at paraprofessionals of other kinds who can help deliver face-to-face services, plus the whole tech equation on the side to help make more, a greater diversity of services available to these people. But I don't know that we had.
I had one last thing.
Did you have one last thing? Good.
The New Zealand, so that there's a sort of world first. Again, it's a positive story. So the New Zealand government says it's become the first to create an algorithm charter for governing the use of algorithms by public agencies. We've looked before, and Zach and Victoria obviously did some really extensive research looking at algorithms and the kind of the black box, the concerns over them being a black box. And their research talked about Wisconsin and Loomis, which is obviously one of the cases where in the US where they relied on an algorithm compass in that case in order to extend Eric Loomis's sentence. Anyway, in New Zealand, they have come up with a charter which specifically says that if they've come up with kind of I've sort of looked at it fairly briefly, but there's different types of if it impacts on if it's used in a decision that's going to impact on someone's life, then they have to interrogate, but you have to understand the data that enabled that decision to be reached, which seems like a complete no-brainer, right? Like, you need to understand how that decision was made. Amazing. But obviously that's not actually, although it sounds like a no-brainer, that's actually not what's happening in a lot of cases. There's the trust that of the output of a lot of these tools when they really don't. So they've made this pretty significant commitment that you need to clearly explain how decisions are informed by algorithms, including publishing information about how data is collected, secured, and stored. And there is a commitment to make sure that data is fit for purpose by understanding its limitations and managing bias. And that's been signed by 21 agencies in New Zealand. And I think hopefully that will be the start of other similar charters, because it certainly ought to be.
It ought to be. As you say, that's a good news story, but it's going to depend on where you sit as to whether that's a good news story. Right. Some of the vendors may not agree that that's a good news story.
No, you're right. And in terms of the other thing that occurred to me is, it's all very well, they've come up very excited about it, but it's very difficult, as we note, there's a lot of, the governments don't write this, a lot of it, unless it's open source technology, how do you really it's very hard to unpick, actually. Sometimes it's actually really difficult to work out what the bias is, to understand exactly what the data is. It's a really time consuming process, and you hope, you sort of wonder what's actually realistic, and hope that they will honor their commitment, but understand what it is they're committing to, because, and I started to wonder about, I don't think there's any competitive element for governments in terms of using this type of stuff, but there's always that fear, isn't there, that you don't want to fall behind, and if other governments aren't making the same commitment, are you going to then feel, there's all these, it's very complex, but so it'll be interesting. I think this is one of those stories where we need to follow it up, perhaps and then see how they've got on.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's really great.
Well, and I think that the vendors, I can understand why they'd have some reticence about this, but I also think that they should welcome it, because the biggest barrier to using AI tools is the element of trust, right? The user doesn't trust the output because they don't know where the output comes from. And so they don't want to use the AI tool, because then they're just going to have to redo whatever it is to make sure that the output is correct. And for example, legal research, I'm gonna have to conduct the research in a regular search engine to make sure that I think that they're giving me the information I need. And at that point, what's the point of paying for this AI search engine when I'm redoing the work anyway? So if you have an understanding as the consumer of where this information is coming from, and if bias is a concern for you, which it should be, but then you're also assured that there's not bias built into it that's going to somehow affect the output. So I think in some ways that would actually encourage people to utilize AI software, because it's already been vetted, if you will, rather than just by a private company. That being said, you did say, you alluded to the fact that it's time consuming to do that. And so I can understand why they might have some issues. Or if you're like Clearview, for example, and you've unlawfully scraped the internet for data, I can see why you'd have a problem with that as well. Allegedly, unlawfully
and also to Joe's point about understanding, do they have the expertise? And it's obviously there's a lot of, it's quite a complex area, and that relies on quite a lot of collaboration and sort of whether they have the expertise in order to achieve what it is they're trying to achieve.
Well, there's also an aspect of the fact that there is intellectual property contained in these algorithms sometimes. I mean, a company, in revealing its algorithm is going to be revealing what's unique or special about its algorithm if it's 100% transparent about it, and then it's sort of giving away the shop a little bit if it does that, even if there are IP protections around it. I mean, that may be a concern for some companies, I think. But
I just wanted to raise a point that Sean Jameson sent in the comments about rural attorneys being difficult to recruit folks to come in and practice. A lot of people just they want to either get out or move on. But I'm wondering if that's going to change now that a lot of people are looking at fleeing their urban areas. We're seeing a huge shift, and the ability now to maintain a large firm practice or practice in a large city and be in a remote setting. So I feel like there's this great opportunity now. I'm hearing more and more lawyers and professionals say that now that they know they can work so effectively remotely, they're going to move back to hometown. They're looking for farmland. They're looking to get their ideal home in the mountains, as long as they can get bandwidth and maybe have a crash pad in a city where they spend some time occasionally to meet in person. You could be anywhere. And I feel like there's this opportunity to attract lawyers to come into some of these rural areas, especially where there's a strong legal need and there's a reason, an opportunity for practice.
Yeah. And I mean, look, ultimately you're going to go where the work is, right? I mean, if you're, if you get laid off from a firm, or you get, like laid off or fired or whatnot for economic reasons and whatnot. I mean, maybe the first instinct is to set up your own shingle and do it on your own and go with all the hundreds of thousands of other people that are doing it in New York City or in DC or in San Francisco or whatever. But, ultimately, not everyone's going to be able to do that. Not everyone's going to be able to survive. And, is it, maybe a lot of people that go to law school, they think, oh, well, I'm not going to want to stay in my rural town. I want to go live in, the big city. But ultimately, you're going to have to do what you have to do what's best for your career, what's best for your family, what's best for your life. And if that means moving to, one of these legal deserts and setting up shop there and, getting that business, then, why not?
Yeah, I had this experience in my own life a little bit. When early on, when I was very young, I practiced for a while in the Virgin Islands, and one of the odd things about the bar of the Virgin Islands is it was largely composed of people like me who went down there because it seemed like a fun place to move to and live in, but people who grew up in the Virgin Islands and went off to go to law school often didn't come back because they discovered the big city and they discovered they could make a lot more money up there and there were a lot more jobs up there. So even when there were programs to sort of, help provide scholarships and whatever to send people from the Virgin Islands to law school, they would not end up coming back to the Virgin Islands to practice law. They would end up staying wherever the heck they were or somewhere in the United States. So, there, somebody has actually asked a question here, which maybe we can give a little feedback on. Regarding, says, I enjoy your conversations about rollouts of new apps in the legal tech space. In your collective experience, what is the most important part of launching a new app? And what's the most memorable launch you've seen and why? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I get a bit boring about this, but I think I've already said, make sure that it solves a problem. I guess maybe that's earlier. Maybe that's not to do with the launch. Maybe that's to do with the actual creation. So that maybe doesn't. I suppose he's actually asking about the launch itself in terms of the marketing side of things.
Well, there are some companies that don't ever think about that until they get to the launch stage.
Right. So I would explain to people very clearly what it solves, right? So, and where it fits in the market, and position yourself, because people like to they don't have much time, and we all like to operate in boxes. I know I'm quite guilty of, I want to understand quickly and I want to know exactly where it fits. And so I want to know what it does, what it solves, and where you fit in the market. And if you can explain that really quickly, I think that immediately positions, you have to create a nice little box for yourself.
Yeah.
I think Caroline's right. And the other thing for me is that we used to write about apps all the time, and they're often really good ideas, great opportunities to solve a problem or a pain point for lawyers or consumers, and no path to adoption. Zero way to get wide enough adoption for this to be useful to anyone. So being able to see a path to adoption is really important, at least from my perspective as a journalist, to cover something. And I've seen that done effectively with partnerships in pilot programs with bar associations or communities, where they can demonstrate that that users have tried this even in a beta, and that it solved so many problems or it works. And that with a little bit of a boost with people writing about it, they may actually be able to solve even more problems. That's my take.
Yeah, for something specific, I think. Actually, I know we talk about Josh Browder a lot. I think whatever they did for their rollout, was very good. Because they got a bunch of outlets to write about how there's correctly or not, this robot lawyer app that's going to take care of your parking tickets, and that instantly catches your attention. You're like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is really interesting. Even people who are in that field are like, oh my God, this is very interesting. How there's this app now that can help me fight a traffic ticket. Who can't relate to that? And I just thought I thought that was a very effective I don't know if it's just the product was something that really resonated with a lot of people, as far as its original purpose, or if it happened to catch the attention of a lot of journalists who helped blow it up. But I thought that was a very effective campaign, as far as launching an app goes. I was very impressed by that one.
Well, and we're still, I think we actually might have touched on this before. There was certainly debate when he first launched the Do Not Pay app about whether the media had, whether the media or perhaps he had exaggerated the numbers of cases or the dollar amounts involved in the cases that had been resolved by that app, at least initially. But
definitely,
people certainly picked up on it and ran with it. And maybe that answers the other part of this question, which was, what was the most memorable launch you've seen and why? Other than Do Not Pay, or any other really memorable app launches? And I don't know by app whether he literally just means an app or an application of any kind, but anything else that jumps out at you?
Well, for me, it's always when case text came onto the playing field, and when they, with that brief analyzer, now everyone else has jumped on the bandwagon, but that to me was a really unusual, unique way at the time. Now other people are doing it, but of using artificial intelligence to provide a different way of looking at legal research. So that was always really interesting to me, and I thought that was it was just a unique solution or way of approaching an issue thing that we all needed to do and have been doing in the same way over and over for years and years and years. And they came at it from a new angle. So I thought that was really interesting. That's the only one that really stands out in my mind.
Yeah. And that was more the product than the launch. I mean, they didn't really, I don't think they did anything particularly fancy about the launch of that. It was just, the product was really unique when they came out with it.
Right.
Sometimes I'm kind of disappointed in myself that my memories are, the big launches had a ton of money behind them. Like Zoom just suddenly appeared on, not Zoom, LegalZoom started appearing on every single commercial. That was back when there were still commercial TV, and they were everywhere on ads. Everywhere I saw, they just did a full court press, and Thomson Reuters Westlaw, for their Westlaw product, used to do huge launches like that, where just everywhere you went in legal, you would see their brand and their new product, and they did trainings. And I do think I do like launches that include product trainings and introductions and demos that are easily accessible. I think that helps too.
Yeah, and they would rent out buses in the cities where the legal conferences were. Like the whole side of the bus would be plastered with the Westlaw logo, and crazy things like that.
I mean, I went to a conference where I spent like an hour just with personalized training. Well, it was like 100 people in a room, but learning how to use the product. That was great, and then I could use it.
Yeah. So. Was it Bloomberg Law was it last year at ILTA? I think maybe. Or I forget which conference it was. That in, or maybe AALL, where they were rolling out a new product, which turns out they weren't actually rolling it out at that point, but they were previewing it. But they invited everybody to a speakeasy, and there was kind of a secretive thing around why they were inviting you there, and it was really hard to find the place. And you got there, and they were like, everybody had taken them up on it. It was packed with people waiting to get into this little speakeasy, and they were doing demos of this new product. That was effective.
The question I was going to, the only thing, sorry, I kept interrupting you, but I was going to say, sometimes the biggest blasts are not followed up with, so I think about Thomson Reuters Panoramic. Okay, they didn't do a speakeasy, we got a demo, and it was all like, oh, this is how many years of research, and this is going to be the new. And I actually called it and I got a little bit of flack about this. I called it game changing, right? And I got really, really excited about it. And I'm like, this is the new, this is amazing. And I haven't heard about. I don't know what was it. Anyone know what's happened with Panoramic? So I'm not sure. Perhaps it's me. Perhaps I'm a bit out of touch, but I've not heard of it since. And so my game changer article is about the only thing that I think's been written about it, right? And so it kind of made me a little bit nervous as well about sometimes being too, confident off the bat.
Yeah. Well, we talked last week on Thomson Reuters anti-splash rollout of its new legal news service. It was more that it kind of tripped over letting it leak out the door rather than making a big announcement about it. But I think that was by intent also. Yeah. Well, we are we've gone way too long already here, and I think it's time to wrap up. But we, as I think a lot of you know who registered for today, we have now set it up so you should, if you registered to attend today, you should just get a reminder in advance of next week's program and shouldn't have to re-register. So we hope to see you again next week, same time, same place. Let us know in advance if you've got any stories you want us to talk about. You can reach any of us. I'm sure you all know where to find us, but Twitter or wherever. And thanks to you all for listening, and thanks to the panelists for participating again. See you all next week.
Thanks, Bob. See you next week.
Have a good weekend all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.